August 16th, 1943, 28,000 feet above Tsili Tsili airstrip, New Guinea. Lieutenant Colonel Neel Kearby adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the crystal-clear tropical sky through the greenhouse canopy of his Republic P-47D Thunderbolt. Below him, 2 squadrons of his 348th Fighter Group climbed laboriously toward combat altitude, their massive Pratt and Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engines straining against gravity and the thin air. Through his binoculars, Japanese reconnaissance pilots had been watching these strange new American fighters for weeks. Reports filtered back to their commanders at Wewak described aircraft that seemed impossible. 7 tons of metal powered by a single engine, corpulent fuselages topped with bulbous canopies, wings that looked too small for such massive bodies. To pilots accustomed to the featherweight Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar and the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero, these American machines appeared almost comical. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. They send us flying sake barrels. One Japanese pilot had radioed after his first sighting, unable to suppress his laughter at the ungainly silhouettes. The mockery was universal. In ready rooms across New Guinea and Rabaul, Japanese Army and Navy pilots shared jokes about the fat American fighters. Some called them beer barrels with wings. Others dubbed them pregnant whales. What those Japanese pilots didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would force a complete tactical revolution in Pacific air combat. Within 6 months, these flying sake barrels would transform from objects of derision into instruments of calculated destruction. The mathematics were already loaded in those broad wings. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, 3,400 rounds of ammunition, a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to saw a fighter in half in under 2 seconds. The transformation began that August morning when Kearby's formation spotted Japanese bombers escorted by fighters approaching the critical supply strip at Tsili Tsili. The former P-39 Airacobra pilot, who had spent months in the Panama Canal zone before taking command of the 348th, understood what his men were about to learn. That survival in the P-47 required abandoning everything conventional fighter doctrine taught about air combat. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt represented a radical departure from every fighter philosophy Japanese pilots had encountered. While the Zero had been designed for maximum maneuverability with minimum weight, sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks to achieve a phenomenal turn radius, the Thunderbolt embodied the opposite philosophy: mass, power, firepower, survivability. The aircraft that first engaged Japanese fighters that August day carried design features that seemed almost wasteful to engineers trained in the Japanese tradition of lightweight efficiency. The pilot sat behind 3/8-inch steel armor plate. Ahead of him, a 1/2-inch bulletproof glass windscreen. The massive Pratt and Whitney radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, could absorb direct hits that would stop a liquid-cooled fighter cold. Among the 56 American pilots spread across the New Guinea sky that morning were men who would test these capabilities to their absolute limits. Future aces, whose names would eventually appear in combat reports, filed by increasingly worried Japanese intelligence officers. But on August 16th, 1943, they were novices in an untested machine, facing pilots who had been fighting continuously since 1937 in China, men with thousands of combat hours, who had swept aside every Allied fighter they'd encountered in the war's first 18 months. The Japanese had been winning since Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were the most experienced fighter force in the Pacific. The Americans flying P-47 seconds that day had exactly 0 combat hours in the type. This is the story of how industrial logic defeated tactical tradition, how American engineering philosophy clashed with Japanese fighter doctrine, and how mockery turned to mortality as Japanese pilots discovered what 8 synchronized Browning machine guns could do to an aircraft designed without armor. The Republic P-47 had emerged from a 1940 panic. As German fighters swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the US Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli designed instead was a monster that seemed to violate every principle of fighter design. At 9,900 pounds empty, the P-47B prototype shocked everyone who saw it. The massive turbo supercharger system, with its complex ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it an almost pregnant appearance. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked the same question. This thing actually flies. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The Pratt and Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, where conventional fighters gasped for air. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level performance in the stratosphere, where the air was too thin for conventional superchargers to function effectively. When the first P-47's arrived in Australia in June 1943, they were met with skepticism bordering on hostility. Lieutenant General George Kenny, commanding the 5th Air Force in the Southwest Pacific, desperately needed fighters. The beloved Lockheed P-38 Lightning was in critically short supply. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk and Bell P-39 Era Cobra, while serviceable, were clearly outclassed by Japanese fighters in most performance parameters. That left the Thunderbolt. The problem was immediately apparent. The P-47 had been designed for European theatre operations, for high-altitude bomber escort over Germany, where the thin air favoured its turbo-supercharged engine. The Pacific War was different. Most combat occurred below 20,000 feet, where the Thunderbolt's massive weight became a liability rather than an asset. Worse, the aircraft's fuel consumption was prodigious. Its range, even with internal tanks full, was barely adequate for Pacific operations where targets might be hundreds of miles across open ocean. Japanese intelligence officers, receiving reports of the new American fighter's arrival, conducted their assessments with professional thoroughness. Technical specifications were compiled from cracked aircraft and pilot observations. The analysis seemed to confirm every assumption about American fighter design philosophy. The P-47 massed nearly twice what a Zero weighed. Its wing loading was far higher, meaning it needed more speed to generate the same lift. Its roll rate at low speeds was poor. Most damningly, it couldn't turn with any Japanese fighter in service. Major Takeyoshi Ono, an experienced fighter leader with the Japanese Army's 77th Sentai flying Ki-43 Oscars from Wewak, issued tactical guidance to his pilots after reviewing the intelligence reports. The new American fighter relies on weight and engine power rather than maneuverability. It will attempt to use diving attacks from altitude. If forced into turning combat at low to medium speeds, it is helpless. Our lighter fighters maintain every advantage in traditional combat. Engage with confidence. This assessment, distributed throughout Japanese fighter units in New Guinea and the Solomons, would prove catastrophically wrong. But in August 1943, it represented the consensus view of virtually every Japanese pilot who had examined the Thunderbolt from a distance. Neel Kearby, now a lieutenant colonel, understood that conventional tactics would get his pilots killed. The 51 P-47's of the 348th Fighter Group that deployed to Port Moresby in late June 1943 represented a significant investment of American industrial capacity. Each aircraft had cost nearly $100,000 to produce. Each pilot had received over 400 hours of flight training, an investment of time and resources that Japan simply couldn't match by mid-1943. Kearby had been thinking about how to employ the Thunderbolt since taking command of the 348th at Mitchell Field, New York, in October 1942. He understood the aircraft's weaknesses: the terrible climb rate at sea level, the poor low-speed handling, the fuel consumption that limited range. But he also understood its strengths, advantages so overwhelming they could negate every disadvantage if exploited correctly. The P-47 could dive faster than any fighter in existence. From altitude, It could reach speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, velocities that made deflection shooting nearly impossible for defending fighters. Its massive weight, initially seen as a crippling disadvantage, became a weapon in the dive. Gravity and mass combined to generate acceleration that lightweight Japanese fighters simply couldn't match. More importantly, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger meant it could fight at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled. At 28,000 feet, where Kearby preferred to patrol, the R-2800 engine delivered full-rated power. Meanwhile, Japanese fighters with their single-stage superchargers were operating well above their optimal altitude. Their engines produced perhaps 70% of rated horsepower. Their controls became mushy in the thin air. Their climb rate, so impressive at medium altitudes, became anemic above 25,000 feet. Kearby developed what would become known as the boom and zoom tactic, though his pilots simply called it Kearby's turkey shoot. The 348th would take off from Port Moresby and immediately climb to maximum altitude. At 28 to 30,000 feet, they would cruise toward their target, normally a Japanese base at Wewak, Rabaul, or one of the smaller airstrips scattered across New Guinea. When Japanese fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive. By the time they reached the enemy formation, they would be traveling at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. At these velocities, the P-47's 850 caliber machine guns would speak for perhaps 2 seconds. Then the American fighters would use their tremendous speed to zoom climb back to altitude before the Japanese could react. The first combat test came on August 16th. 2 squadrons of the 348th encountered Japanese bombers with fighter escort over Tsili Tsili. The Thunderbolts were at 26,000 feet. The Japanese formation was at 15,000 feet, a typical bombing altitude. Kearby's voice crackled over the radio. "Tally-ho, enemy bombers 12 o'clock low. Follow me down." What happened in the next 3 minutes would be reported by both sides, though with vastly different interpretations. The American pilots saw their speed indicators climbing past 350, 400, 420 miles per hour as they plummeted toward the Japanese formation. Their massive fighters, so sluggish at low speeds, became stable gun platforms in the dive. The hydraulically boosted controls remained responsive even as shock waves began forming on the wings. At 1,500 feet range, Kearby opened fire. All 8 guns. The convergence zone, set at 300 yards, created a cone of destruction that anything in its path would encounter over 150 projectiles per second. His target, a Mitsubishi Ki-43 Sally bomber, seemed to stagger in the air as half-inch projectiles tore through its aluminum skin. The Japanese bomber's fuel tanks, lacking the self-sealing compound standard in American aircraft, erupted in flames. Kearby's wingmen followed, each selecting targets from the bomber formation. The Japanese escort fighters, nimble Ki-43 Oscars, attempted to intervene, but they were too low, too slow. The Thunderbolts flashed through the formation at speeds the Oscar pilots had never encountered in combat. By the time the Japanese fighters could react, the P-47 seconds were already 5,000 feet above them, climbing away on the tremendous energy stored in their high-speed dives. The Americans claimed 3 Japanese aircraft destroyed in that first engagement. They suffered no losses. For the 348th Fighter Group, it was a modest beginning. For the Japanese pilots who survived, it was deeply troubling. The P-47 seconds had appeared from nowhere, attacked with devastating firepower, and escaped before defensive action was possible. This wasn't how air combat worked. This violated every principle of fighter versus fighter combat that Japanese pilots had learned in 6 years of war. Flight Sergeant Shigeo Nishimura, flying an Oscar from the 77th Sentai, filed a combat report that evening at Wewak. Enemy fighters attacked from high altitude at extreme speed. Our formation attempted to engage, but the American aircraft climbed away before interception was possible. Their diving speed exceeds anything we have encountered. Standard pursuit tactics are ineffective. The report made its way up the chain of command. Senior officers read it with skepticism. American fighters that couldn't be caught? That didn't turn to fight like proper warriors. It contradicted everything they knew about American pilot temperament. Americans were aggressive, sometimes foolishly so. They could be baited into turning fights where Japanese maneuverability would prevail. This new tactic, if it was indeed a tactic and not simply cowardice, required study. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. The 348th flew combat air patrols at maximum altitude. When Japanese aircraft appeared below, the Thunderbolts would dive, attack with their overwhelming firepower, and climb away before the enemy could mount an effective defense. Japanese losses began to mount. More troubling for Japanese commanders, the pilots who survived these encounters returned with reports that challenged fundamental assumptions about aerial warfare. The P-47, they reported, was not helpless. Its guns were devastating. The concentration of fire was unlike anything they'd faced. Zeros and Oscars hit by the 50 caliber streams didn't just fall from the sky damaged. They disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselages. Tails were severed. Pilots had no chance to bail out when their aircraft was caught in the convergence zone. Warrant Officer Satoshi Anabuki, an ace with the 50th Sentai Flying Ki-43 seconds, encountered P-47 seconds on September 4, 1943. His subsequent report, preserved in Japanese archives, revealed growing concern. The enemy's new fighter uses altitude and speed as weapons. It does not engage in turning combat. Its armament appears to be unusually heavy machine guns, multiple weapons firing simultaneously. Aircraft struck by this concentrated fire are destroyed instantly. I observed Sergeant Nakamura's fighter break apart after less than 2 seconds of enemy fire. This is not battle damage. This is complete destruction. September 11th, 1943, brought the most significant engagement yet. Neel Kearby, now a full colonel, led 4 P-47 seconds on a fighter sweep over Wewak. His wingmen were 2nd Lieutenant Samuel Blair, 2nd Lieutenant William Dunham, and 1st Lieutenant John Moore. The mission called for reconnaissance of Japanese air bases, destruction of any aircraft encountered, and return to Port Moresby. Intelligence estimated at least 40 Japanese fighters were based at Wewak. At 28,000 feet over Wewak, Kearby spotted aircraft below, many aircraft. A Japanese bomber formation with fighter escort, perhaps 40 fighters total. Standard doctrine would have called for breaking off the attack. 4 American fighters against 40 Japanese aircraft represented suicidal odds by any conventional calculation. But Kearby understood the mathematics differently. His 4 P-47 seconds, attacking from 12,000 feet above the enemy formation, would arrive at the merge, travelling at over 400 miles per hour. The Japanese fighters, cruising at perhaps 200 miles per hour while escorting bombers, would be caught completely unprepared for high-speed combat. "Drop tanks," Kearby ordered. The auxiliary fuel tanks fell away, reducing drag and increasing acceleration. "Follow me down. Hit the fighters, not the bombers." The 4 Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dived almost vertically toward the unsuspecting Japanese formation. What happened in the next 15 minutes would become legendary in both air forces, though the details remain disputed. Kearby's gun camera footage and combat report, supported by his wingmen's testimony, claimed 6 victories. Japanese records acknowledge heavy losses but differ on specifics. What's not disputed is that Kearby executed multiple firing passes on Japanese fighters, destroying at least 4 and possibly 6 in rapid succession. His wingmen each claimed victories. The Japanese escort fighters, caught completely by surprise, attempted to respond but found themselves unable to corner the high-speed American fighters. Every time Japanese pilots lined up a shot, the P-47 seconds would use their tremendous speed to extend away, climb, and reset for another attack. One Japanese Army Air Force pilot, whose identity remains unknown, managed to damage Kearby's aircraft during the engagement. The Thunderbolt absorbed 20mm cannon hits that would have downed any Japanese fighter. Kearby continued fighting, shot down another enemy aircraft, then led his formation to an emergency landing strip at Leh, landing with less than 75 gallons remaining in his tanks. The engagement made Kearby a national hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for this single mission. More significantly, it proved that properly employed P-47 seconds could dominate Japanese fighters despite overwhelming numerical odds. The key was altitude, speed, and disciplined adherence to boom and zoom tactics. Engage only from advantageous positions. Never, under any circumstances, allow the fight to develop into a low-speed turning contest. Between August and December 1943, the 348th Fighter Group claimed over 150 victories, while losing only 8 pilots. These numbers, like many World War II air combat claims, require careful interpretation. Modern research comparing American claims with Japanese loss records suggests the actual Japanese losses were lower, perhaps half the claimed total. Kill ratio calculations are further complicated by the fact that some American losses were to ground fire, accidents, and mechanical failures rather than enemy action. What's beyond dispute is that the P-47, despite initial skepticism, proved highly effective in the Southwest Pacific when employed correctly. The massive fighter that Japanese pilots had mocked was exacting a toll that Japanese air power in New Guinea could not sustain. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was profound. Men who had dominated every fighter versus fighter engagement since 1941 were now facing an opponent they couldn't catch, couldn't turn with at high speeds, and couldn't survive if caught in the convergence pattern of 8 50-caliber machine guns. The traditional samurai warrior ethos, emphasizing individual combat, skill and aggressive spirit, offered no answer to systematic altitude superiority and overwhelming firepower. Major Takeyoshi Ono, who had issued confident tactical guidance in August, filed a revised assessment in November. The American P-47 fighter cannot be engaged using conventional tactics. Its altitude performance exceeds our fighters. Its diving speed makes pursuit impossible. Its heavy armament destroys our aircraft in seconds. Recommend avoiding engagement unless overwhelming numerical superiority permits coordinated attack from multiple directions simultaneously. This was remarkable. Japanese fighter doctrine, which had emphasized aggressive engagement since the beginning of the war, was now advising pilots to avoid combat with a specific enemy aircraft type. The mockery had stopped. The sake barrel jokes were forgotten. In their place was growing recognition that American industrial might have produced something their lightweight, maneuverable fighters couldn't effectively counter. The P-47's success in the Southwest Pacific rested on several factors beyond raw performance. American logistics ensured consistent fuel supplies, spare parts, and ammunition. Japanese forces in New Guinea, increasingly isolated by Allied naval superiority, struggled with chronic shortages of everything. American pilots received continuous replacement aircraft when their fighters were damaged. Japanese pilots often flew aircraft that were mechanically exhausted, patched together from salvaged parts. American pilots also benefited from superior training. By late 1943, replacement pilots arriving in the Pacific had over 400 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, and instrument instruction. Japanese replacement pilots, victims of an increasingly strained training pipeline, were arriving with less than 200 hours total time, minimal gunnery practice, and virtually no combat tactics instruction. The ammunition difference was particularly significant. Each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds, enough for sustained fire lasting over 30 seconds. Japanese fighters typically carried between 150 and 200 rounds per cannon, enough for perhaps 10 seconds of firing. American pilots could engage targets multiple times in a single sortie. Japanese pilots had to make every burst count. The 50-caliber Browning M2 machine gun itself represented a technological advantage. The weapon fired projectiles weighing just under 2 ounces at muzzle velocities, approaching 3,000 feet per second. The standard ammunition load mixed armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball rounds in patterns designed to both destroy and ignite targets. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously in the precisely calibrated convergence zone, they created a storm of metal that no aircraft structure of that era could withstand. Modern analysis of gun camera footage shows that aircraft caught in this zone typically suffered catastrophic structural failure within 2 seconds. Wings folded, fuselages broke in half, control surfaces were torn away. Japanese fighters, designed without armor and with minimal structural redundancy to save weight, were particularly vulnerable. A Zero or Oscar struck center mass by the P-47's full battery had virtually no chance of survival. The lightweight construction that gave these aircraft their magnificent maneuverability became a fatal liability when facing sustained heavy machine gun fire. The industrial capacity behind the P-47 deployment was itself a weapon that Japanese planners hadn't fully appreciated. Republic Aviation's factory on Long Island was producing P-47 seconds at rates approaching 1 per hour by late 1943. When the Evansville, Indiana plant came online, production doubled. By contrast, Mitsubishi's production of Zero fighters was measured in hundreds per month, and that rate was declining as Allied bombing intensified and materials became scarce. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This meant American losses could be replaced immediately. A P-47 shot down over New Guinea in November might be replaced by a factory-fresh aircraft within weeks. Japanese losses were effectively permanent. Aircraft destroyed could not be replaced quickly enough. More critically, experienced pilots lost were irreplaceable. Japan's training pipeline, never designed for attrition warfare, was collapsing under the strain of sustaining operations across the Pacific. By December 1943, Japanese air strength in New Guinea had been effectively neutralized. The once feared fighter units based at Wewak and Rabaul were shadows of their former strength. Surviving pilots were being withdrawn to rear areas or redeployed to more critical theaters. The combination of P-47 effectiveness, overall Allied air superiority, and Japan's inability to sustain the logistics necessary for continued operations had broken Japanese air power in the Southwest Pacific. The transformation was complete. In 4 months, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved from a maligned flying sake barrel into the dominant fighter in the theater. Japanese pilots who had laughed at its appearance in August were dead, withdrawn, or flying with grim awareness that their nimble, lightweight fighters offered no answer to American altitude superiority and concentrated firepower. The success of the 348th Fighter Group established the template for P-47 operations throughout the Pacific. But it also created a dangerous overconfidence among some American pilots. The Thunderbolt's advantages were real, but they existed only when tactics were followed precisely. Deviation from the boom and zoom doctrine, even for a moment, could prove fatal. Neel Kearby had become the Southwest Pacific's leading P-47 ace by early 1944. With 22 confirmed victories, he was tied with Richard Bong for the title of America's top-scoring fighter pilot. Kearby had been transferred to 5th Air Force Fighter Command Headquarters in November 1943, officially assigned to administrative duties. But like many successful fighter pilots, he found ways to fly combat missions whenever possible. The competition between Kearby and Bong for the ace title was followed closely by the American press. Both men were instructed by General Kenny to exercise caution, to let the record fall naturally rather than taking unnecessary risks. But these were competitive men, keyed up from continuous combat flying, driven by the same aggressive instinct that had made them successful in the first place. March 5, 1944. Kearby led a flight of 4 P-47 seconds on a fighter sweep over Wewak, the same Japanese stronghold where he had earned his Medal of Honor 5 months earlier. His wingmen were Captain Samuel Blair and Captain William Dunham, both experienced pilots who had flown with him since the 348th's first combat missions. At 28,000 feet, Kearby's formation spotted a large group of Japanese fighters below. Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars from the 77th Sentai, perhaps 15 aircraft in a loose formation. The setup was perfect for a classic boom and zoom attack. Kearby led the dive, his P-47 accelerating past 400 miles per hour as it plummeted toward the unsuspecting Japanese fighters. His first pass destroyed one Oscar. Gun camera footage showed the lightweight Japanese fighter breaking apart under concentrated .50 caliber fire. Kearby should have climbed away immediately, using his tremendous speed to zoom back to altitude where the P-47's advantages were overwhelming. Instead, he did something that violated every principle he had taught his pilots. He stayed low and turned back for a second attack. Eyewitnesses differ on exactly why Kearby made this decision. Some believe he wanted to confirm his kill, to ensure the damaged Oscar had actually gone down. Others suggest he saw what he thought was an easy second victory and couldn't resist. Whatever his motivation, the decision was fatal. At low altitude and reduced speed, the P-47's weaknesses became critical vulnerabilities. The massive fighter wallowed in turns. Its roll rate was poor. Most dangerously, Japanese pilots trained for years in low-speed combat could exploit these weaknesses with deadly effectiveness. 3 Ki-43 Oscars, piloted by experienced sergeants from the 77th Sentai, latched onto Kearby's tail. The Oscar's extraordinary maneuverability at speeds below 200 miles per hour was legendary. Nothing could turn with the Ki-43 inches this regime. The Japanese pilots, recognizing the rare opportunity to catch a P-47 inches their preferred fighting conditions, attacked with coordinated precision. Dunham and Blair, desperately trying to assist their commander, shot down 2 of the pursuing Oscars. But the third pilot, whose identity was never definitively established, got a clean burst into Kearby's cockpit from close range. The P-47 went straight into the jungle canopy. There was no parachute. Local witnesses reported seeing Kearby escape the aircraft as it descended, becoming entangled in a tree, where he died from his wounds. His body wasn't recovered until 1947, when a Royal Australian Air Force search team located the crash site. Kearby's death sent shockwaves through the 5th Air Force. If one of their best pilots, a Medal of Honor recipient with over 500 combat hours and intimate knowledge of the P-47's capabilities and limitations, could be killed by violating tactical doctrine, what chance did less experienced pilots have? The lesson was brutally clear. The P-47 dominated when flown correctly. It was vulnerable, even helpless, when pilots allowed themselves to be drawn into the low-speed turning fights where Japanese fighters excelled. General Kenny issued explicit orders following Kearby's death. P-47 pilots were forbidden from engaging in sustained turning combat below 10,000 feet. Pilots who violated this directive and survived faced disciplinary action. The order was controversial among some pilots who saw it as constraining their tactical freedom. But combat results proved its wisdom. Pilots who adhered to boom and zoom tactics continued to achieve favorable kill ratios. Those who violated the doctrine tended to become casualties. By mid-1944, the P-47 was being phased out in the Southwest Pacific, not because it was ineffective, but because the tactical situation had changed. The front lines had moved north and west. Targets were increasingly distant from Allied bases. Even with drop tanks, the P-47's range was marginal for operations against the Philippines and beyond. The long-range P-38 Lightning and newly arrived P-51 Mustang were better suited for extended escort missions. The 348th Fighter Group, which had pioneered P-47 tactics in the Pacific, transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in early 1945. Other Southwest Pacific P-47 units followed. By the war's end, only the 58th Fighter Group, operating in a ground attack role, still flew Thunderbolts in the 5th Air Force. The P-47's future in the Pacific lay not in the Southwest, but in the Central Pacific Theater, where events were creating conditions perfectly suited to the Thunderbolt's unique capabilities. The 7th Air Force, based in Hawaii and tasked with supporting operations across the Central Pacific, had received its first P-47 seconds in mid-1944. The 318th Fighter Group arrived at Saipan in June 1944, flying P-47Ds from the decks of escort carriers in what remains one of the more unusual aircraft deployments of the war. The group immediately engaged in close air support during the continuing ground battle for Saipan, then supported operations on Guam and Tinian. The P-47's ruggedness proved invaluable in the ground attack role. The massive radial engine could absorb ground fire that would have downed liquid-cooled fighters. The aircraft's ability to carry substantial bomb loads, 2,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, made it effective against Japanese fortifications. The 850 caliber machine guns, devastating in air-to-air combat, proved equally effective against ground targets. Throughout 1944, the 318th Fighter Group established the P-47's reputation as a superior ground attack aircraft. The group flew over 5,000 combat sorties, dropped over 1,000 tons of bombs, fired nearly 1,600 rockets, and claimed 31 enemy aircraft destroyed. But the best was yet to come. In April 1945, a new variant of the Thunderbolt began arriving in the Pacific. The P-47 Newtons, developed specifically for long-range operations against Japan, incorporated modifications that addressed every limitation that had plagued earlier models in the Pacific. The most significant change was a completely redesigned wing, wider and with greater internal fuel capacity. The new wing held 93 gallons per side, dramatically extending the aircraft's range. With internal fuel and drop tanks, the P-47 Newtons could fly missions exceeding 2,000 miles. This meant Thunderbolts could escort B-29 superfortresses all the way to Japan from bases in the Marianas. More immediately, it meant P-47 seconds based on Iishima, a small island off Okinawa captured in April 1945, could fly combat air patrols over Japanese home islands. The 318th Fighter Group received P-47's in early 1945 and relocated to Iishima in late April. They were joined by the 413th Fighter Group in May and the 507th Fighter Group in June. All three groups were equipped with the long-range N-model Thunderbolts. Their mission was threefold: escort B-29 seconds attacking Japanese cities, conduct fighter sweeps against Japanese airfields, and intercept kamikaze aircraft before they could reach Allied shipping off Okinawa. The kamikaze threat had become critical by spring 1945. Japanese suicide pilots, flying obsolete aircraft loaded with explosives, were inflicting serious damage on Allied naval forces supporting the Okinawa invasion. Conventional interception tactics were often ineffective. Kamikazes would approach at wave-top level, using terrain masking to avoid radar detection, then pop up for their final dive against ships. The P-47 Newtons proved uniquely suited to the kamikaze interception mission. Its speed advantage allowed it to catch diving enemy aircraft. Its rugged construction meant it could absorb return fire from kamikaze gunners. Most importantly, its devastating firepower meant a single well-aimed burst was usually sufficient to destroy the incoming threat. On one notable occasion, a P-47 Newton's pilot destroyed a kamikaze with a single high-velocity aircraft rocket fired at an aerial target, the first confirmed kill using this method. But the P-47 Newtons' finest hour in the Pacific came in late May 1945. Kamikaze attacks had intensified to the point where Allied commanders authorized deep fighter sweeps over the Japanese home islands, specifically targeting airfields in southern Kyushu, where kamikaze units were based. The goal was to destroy potential suicide aircraft before they could launch against Allied shipping. On May 25, 1945, the 318th Fighter Group launched a maximum-effort fighter sweep over Kyushu. 60 P-47's, flying from Iishima, penetrated Japanese airspace and caught numerous aircraft attempting to take off from multiple airfields. What followed was one of the most one-sided aerial engagements of the Pacific War. The Japanese aircraft encountered that day represented the desperate state of Japanese air power in the war's final months. Many were obsolete types, trainers pressed into combat service as kamikazes. Some were flown by pilots with less than 50 hours total flight time. They were attempting to take off from airfields that were under direct attack, the worst possible circumstance for any aircraft. The P-47's attacked in coordinated waves. Some aircraft strafed parked planes on the ground. Others caught Japanese aircraft during takeoff, when they were most vulnerable, slow and low with limited maneuvering capability. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber machine guns proved devastatingly effective. Aircraft caught on the ground exploded. Aircraft caught during takeoff fell back to Earth in flames. The 318th Fighter Group claimed 21 Japanese aircraft destroyed that day. 3 P-47's were lost, all to ground fire rather than aerial combat. 3 days later, on May 28th, the group returned to Kyushu for another sweep. This time they claimed 27 victories. Combined, the two missions resulted in nearly 50 Japanese aircraft destroyed at a cost of 3 P-47's. These numbers require context. The Japanese aircraft destroyed included trainers, transports, and obsolete fighters that would never have been committed to combat earlier in the war. Many pilots were so inexperienced they barely qualified as trained aviators. The P-47's were attacking at a time when Japanese air power was effectively broken, when fuel shortages meant even available aircraft often couldn't fly, when the most experienced pilots had long since been killed or withdrawn to defend the home islands. Nevertheless, the tactical effectiveness of the P-47 Newtons in these sweeps was undeniable. The aircraft's speed, firepower, and ruggedness made it ideal for the high-tempo, low-altitude combat that characterized these missions. Pilots could attack ground targets, engage airborne opponents, absorb ground fire, and return to base for rearming and refueling within hours. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with P-47's in the war's final months reported experiences remarkably similar to those described by New Guinea veterans 2 years earlier. The American fighters were faster than anything Japan could field. Their firepower was overwhelming. Their construction was so robust that even direct hits often failed to bring them down. Flight Sergeant Kunio Iwashita, flying a Nakajima Ki-43 Frank fighter, one of Japan's most advanced designs, encountered P-47's over Kyushu in June 1945. His post-war testimony captured the complete reversal of tactical superiority. I engaged 3 American fighters that I initially thought were the twin-engine P-38's. When they turned toward me, I realized they were single-engine aircraft, but larger than any I had seen. They were incredibly fast. I attempted a diving attack, but they easily outran me. When one positioned behind me, I tried every evasive maneuver I knew. Nothing worked. His speed was too great. The sound of his guns firing is something I still hear in my nightmares. Like thunder, continuous thunder. My aircraft was hit repeatedly. The engine stopped. The controls failed. I barely escaped by parachute. Major Muraoka Shinichi, commanding the 248th Sentai, provided one of the few recorded Japanese assessments of the P-47's combat effectiveness. After an engagement on December 26, 1943, where 8 Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters fought 16 P-47Ds from the 36th Fighter Squadron, his combat report stated, "They attacked from above, outnumbering us 3 or 4 to 1. However, we lost no fighters. In conclusion, we did not lose, and one Hayabusa, which failed to drop one of its fuel tanks, survived. I am of the firm opinion that the Thunderbolt can be shot down if we take advantage of its mistakes." This report is notable for what it reveals about Japanese tactical thinking even late in the war. Major Muraoka's assessment focused on the fact that his A5RAD unit survived the engagement without loss. He viewed this as a tactical success. What the report doesn't mention is that the Japanese formation was completely scattered, forced to abort its mission, and prevented from engaging its intended targets. The P-47's controlled the engagement from start to finish, attacked at will, and disengaged when they chose to. This perfectly encapsulated the shift in Pacific air combat. Japanese pilots, trained in the warrior tradition that emphasized individual combat prowess and aggressive spirit, evaluated success in terms of honor and survival. American pilots, products of an industrial military system, evaluated success in terms of mission accomplishment and force preservation. The P-47 embodied this American philosophy completely. By August 1945, P-47 seconds were flying very long-range missions that would have been considered impossible when the type first arrived in the Pacific. On August 13, 1945, 2 days before Japan's surrender, the 318th Fighter Group flew a mission from Ieshima to Tokyo and back. The round trip covered 1,680 statute miles and required 8.5 hours of non-stop flying. These P-47Ns were operating at ranges that exceeded the ferry range of a Zero, demonstrating how completely American industrial capacity had solved the problem that had initially seemed to doom the Thunderbolt in the Pacific. The final P-47 air-to-air kill of World War II occurred on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's surrender. A pilot from the 318th Fighter Group shot down a Nakajima Ki-43 Frank fighter over Japan. The irony was profound. The Frank was Japan's best fighter design of the war, capable of matching or exceeding the performance of most American fighters. But by August 1945, superior designs meant nothing. Japan lacked the fuel to fly them, the experienced pilots to maximize their potential, and the industrial capacity to produce them in meaningful numbers. The statistics of P-47 operations in the Pacific tell a story of evolving effectiveness. The 348th Fighter Group, the first P-47 unit in the Southwest Pacific, scored 396 victories, over half of all kills credited to 5th Air Force P-47 seconds. The group produced 20 P-47 aces, an impressive achievement for a fighter type that supposedly wasn't suited for Pacific operations. Modern research suggests these numbers were inflated, as were most World War II air combat claims from all nations. Cross-referencing with Japanese records indicates actual Japanese losses were probably 60 to 70% of claimed totals. Nevertheless, the P-47's overall combat record in the Pacific was unquestionably successful. When flown according to proper tactics, exploiting altitude and speed advantages, the Thunderbolt achieved favorable kill ratios against all Japanese fighter types. The aircraft's greatest vulnerabilities, poor, low speed, handling and limited maneuverability, could be managed through disciplined adherence to boom and zoom doctrine. Pilots who violated this doctrine, as Neel Kearby tragically demonstrated, paid the price. The P-47's true legacy in the Pacific may be less about kill ratios and more about what it represented. The aircraft embodied American industrial philosophy applied to warfare. Instead of pursuing the lightest, most maneuverable fighter possible, American designers had created the heaviest single-engine fighter ever mass-produced. They had wrapped it in armor, given it overwhelming firepower, and powered it with an engine that could maintain performance at altitudes where enemy fighters gasped for air. This approach contradicted everything Japanese military culture valued. The samurai tradition emphasized purity of purpose, simplicity of means, and individual warrior skill. The Zero fighter, with its incredible range and maneuverability achieved through elimination of unnecessary features like armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, perfectly embodied this philosophy. The P-47 represented the opposite approach. Nothing was eliminated. Everything was added. Armor, redundant systems, overwhelming firepower, massive engine. The assumption was that industrial capacity could overcome any weight penalty. Japanese pilots discovered that in a war of industrial attrition, American assumptions proved correct. The P-47's weight, initially mocked as evidence of poor design, enabled survivability that kept experienced pilots alive to fly again. Its massive engine, which seemed wasteful to engineers trained in Japanese efficiency, delivered altitude performance that decided battles before they began. Its 8 machine guns, dismissed as inferior to cannon, created a concentration of fire that destroyed everything it touched. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese pilots revealed the psychological impact of facing the P-47. These men had begun the war convinced of their superiority, confident that warrior spirit and superior skill would triumph over material disadvantages. The P-47 forced them to confront the reality that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and systematic application of technology mattered more than individual courage. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most famous aces who survived the war with 64 claimed victories, provided perhaps the most honest assessment. The American pilots in New Guinea were very good, and their planes were very good too. The P-38 we could sometimes outmaneuver at lower altitudes. The P-47 we could not engage on equal terms at all. It would patrol above the altitude at which the Zero could effectively operate. Their great speed at high altitudes allowed them to maneuver into the most advantageous positions. Then the big fighters would plunge from the sky to smash into the hapless Zero fighters. Another Japanese pilot, interviewed for the 1957 film Zero Fighter, stated, "On my first confrontation with the P-47, I was astonished to find an American aircraft that could outrun, outclimb, and outdive our Zero, which we thought was the most superior fighter plane in the world." This testimony came from a man who had spent years believing Japanese fighters were inherently superior, that American pilots lacked the warrior spirit necessary for aerial combat. The P-47 shattered these illusions completely. The industrial statistics behind the P-47 deployment were themselves a form of psychological warfare. Republic Aviation produced over 15,600 P-47 seconds during the war. At peak production, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed one Thunderbolt every hour, around the clock. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft per month by 1944. These production rates exceeded the entire Japanese fighter output by significant margins. Each P-47 required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, and 2,000 pounds of aluminum. The engine alone contained 2,400 components, machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that exceeded peacetime standards. The logistics of supplying P-47 units in the Pacific were equally impressive. Each combat sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, with hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions by 1945. Ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month. American industry supplied this demand without strain. The fuel consumption was enormous. Each P-47 burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat with water injection engaged. The 7th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All of it had to be shipped across the Pacific in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production. Japanese forces, meanwhile, were running out of everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, replacement aircraft, and replacement pilots. The training disparity became critical by 1945. American P-47 pilots arrived in combat theaters with over 400 hours of flight time, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, instrument instruction, and combat tactics training. They had practiced against captured Japanese aircraft, understanding their enemy's capabilities and limitations. They knew their aircraft systems intimately, having studied technical manuals that German and Japanese pilots never received. Japanese replacement pilots by 1945 were arriving at combat units with less than 100 hours total time. They had received minimal gunnery practice, ammunition being too precious for extensive training. They had no opportunity to practice against captured American aircraft. Many had never flown at night, never flown in instrument conditions, never fired their guns at a moving target. They were, in effect, sacrificial offerings to a tactical situation that Japan had already lost. The Mexican 201st Fighter Squadron, operating P-47Ds in the Philippines from March 1945 until the war's end, flew 791 sorties against Japanese forces and lost no pilots or aircraft to enemy action. This perfect record, achieved by a unit that was neither American nor particularly large, demonstrates how completely the balance of air power had shifted by the war's final months. Japanese air forces that had once dominated the Pacific were reduced to ineffectiveness by a combination of attrition, logistical collapse, and overwhelming Allied material superiority. The P-47 Thunderbolt ended World War II with an overall kill ratio of 4.6 to 1 across all theaters. In the Pacific specifically, calculating exact kill ratios is complicated by incomplete records, overclaiming by all sides, and the changing quality of opposition over time. What's certain is that P-47 units consistently achieved favorable results when doctrine was followed, that the aircraft's advantages more than compensated for its disadvantages, and that Japanese pilots came to fear and respect the big American fighter. The transformation was complete. The flying sake barrel that Japanese pilots had mocked in August 1943 had become, by August 1945, a symbol of American industrial might and tactical superiority. The mockery had died with the men who voiced it, shot down by the very aircraft they had underestimated. The laughter that echoed through Japanese ready rooms in that distant summer of 1943 was replaced by grim silence as surviving pilots acknowledged a truth their military culture had never prepared them to accept: that in modern warfare, industrial capacity and systematic application of technology would triumph over individual warrior skill. At war's end, captured Japanese aviation officers were interrogated about Allied aircraft. The file on the P-47, updated continuously throughout the war by Japanese intelligence, showed a remarkable evolution in assessment. August 1943. Large, unmaneuverable fighter. Inferior to Japanese types in most performance parameters, except diving speed. Heavy machine gun armament of limited effectiveness. Assessment. Minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional high-altitude performance. Extreme structural strength. Heavy armament increasingly problematic. Pilots showing improved tactical discipline. Assessment. Significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber. Superior to all Japanese types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot down extremely difficult. Assessment. Critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and high-altitude performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment. Unsurvivable in direct engagement. This progression, from minimal threat to unsurvivable in direct engagement in less than 2 years, captured the complete reversal of tactical superiority. Japanese pilots who had begun the war convinced of their invincibility ended it, acknowledging the futility of engaging American fighters flown by well-trained pilots and supported by unlimited industrial capacity. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, Adolf Galland, former head of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about various Allied fighters. His comments on the P-47 are worth noting. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. If this was true of the European theatre, it was equally true in the Pacific. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some twin-engine fighters from the previous war. Its engine produced more power than entire bomber formations from World War I. Its weapons delivered more firepower than a squad of infantry. Yet it was built by the thousands, flown by young men barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trade in weeks. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Its placard lists specifications and battle honors, but the real story is told by the aircraft itself. The massive cowling housing the Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine, the thick wings that held fuel, ammunition, and structure strong enough to survive battle damage. The 8 gun ports in the wings, each representing a weapon that fired 100 rounds per second. The armor plate behind the pilot's seat, thick enough to stop 20mm cannon shells. This was not an aircraft designed for elegance. It was designed for industrial warfare, built to be produced in thousands, flown by hundreds, and maintained under field conditions. It represented American engineering philosophy applied to aerial combat, overwhelming force, systematic approach, and acceptance that weight and complexity could be offset by industrial capacity and pilot training. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. Japanese pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in August 1943. They called it a flying sake barrel, mocked its corpulent fuselage and 2 small wings. By May 1945, there were few Japanese pilots left to laugh. Most were dead, shot down by the very aircraft they had underestimated. Others had been withdrawn from combat, their units dissolved, their aircraft grounded by fuel shortages. The survivors carried memories of that distinctive thunder, the sound of 8 Browning machine guns firing simultaneously, a sound that meant death was coming at 400 miles per hour from 30,000 feet above. The mockery had turned to mortality. The laughter had died with the men who voiced it, and the sky, from New Guinea to Japan, belonged to the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the industrial nation that built 15,000 of them while fighting a war on 2 oceans simultaneously. The flying sake barrel had spoken, and the Pacific would never forget its thunder.